Good afternoon. My name is Karen Street, and I'm the Executive Director of the Congressional Black Caucus. Good afternoon. My name is Karen Street, and I'm the Executive Director of the Congressional Black Caucus. And I want to thank you all for joining us for today's panel. We are excited for a great lineup of attorneys general to have a conversation with us all about meeting the moment and the movement. And this is about Democratic attorneys general, policing, and protests. Months ago, we saw the tragic loss of life of George Floyd on camera for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And it sparked not only a moment, but a movement. We have seen thousands of protests, not only in every state, but around the world. And we've had a reckoning with racism in this country and a very serious conversation about policing reform in America. We are very proud of the fact that the Congressional Black Caucus, under the leadership of Karen Bass, and with decades of leadership from many of our members on policing reform, we're able to move in 30 days in the House of Representatives to pass meaningful legislation, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, to address the policing reform issues that we see and to answer the calls of thousands in the street for us to finally reform our policing system. Unfortunately, the Senate has not acted on that bill, but thankfully, under the leadership of states with Democratic attorneys general, we have seen a lot of action in our state governments, and that's exactly why we need to make sure that we are putting Democratic attorneys general in office and voting for them up and down the ticket. So we're excited to have this conversation, and I want to go ahead and turn it over to our AGs to introduce themselves. Let's go ahead and start with DAGA co-chair, Oregon AG Ellen Rosenblum.
Thank you, Karen. Hi, everyone. I'm Ellen Rosenblum, Oregon Attorney General, and also the co-chair proudly of the Democratic Attorney Generals Association. So I'm so delighted to be here today with my wonderful AG colleagues from all around the country for this really, really important discussion. And of course, proud to be part of the Democratic National Convention, which is starting up today, of course. We work on behalf of our own constituents, but we also work together as Democratic AGs to ensure that all hands are on deck when the critical national legal issues of the day pop up, and frankly, where we're needed to push back against unconstitutional and illegal conduct on the part of, well, lots of people, lots of entities, but lately, especially during these past, almost 4 years, it's frequently been against the federal Trump administration. So I want to give a shout out, first of all, to everyone who's gone out into the streets to protest against police brutality and racial injustices. And this probably includes a fair number of our viewers who are tuning in right now. So thank you for making your voices heard, because if it weren't for your energy and your perseverance, we wouldn't be having this discussion today, or any of the important discussions that leaders have had about racial justice and police brutality. Right now, leaders here in Oregon and across the country are primarily focused on reimagining how police interact with their communities that they serve and how we hold officers and departments accountable to not only make sure that nobody dies the way George Floyd did, but also to make sure communities have faith in law enforcement and our justice system. So I'm excited and I'm humbled to be playing an active role in this process of change and reform. And I look forward to the conversation with all the rest of you this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Well, it's great to see you, AG Rosenblum, and all of my other colleagues from across the nation. And Karen, thanks so much for agreeing to moderate this important conversation. My name is Aaron Ford. I am the Attorney General for the state of Nevada. Again, delighted to be having this conversation. Delighted in quotes, right? Because who really wants to be having a conversation in the aftermath of a person's killing? When I ran for office, I ran under the premise that I would be the Attorney General who looked out for all of Nevada's families, whether you had been here for 3 generations or 3 weeks, whether you are married with 2.5 children or a single parent with 3 children. whether you are gay or straight. It didn't matter. I was going to be here to represent Nevada families. One of the things that I said that we would focus on in that area was on criminal justice and criminal justice reform. I am not delighted to have to be focusing on this in the context of the killing of George Floyd, but it does, and it has presented an opportunity for me and others around the nation who have a sincere interest in pursuing racial justice to elevate the conversation and move beyond conversation to actual policy and implementation. I too want to commend those who are out there protesting. And I hear you. And one of the things that happened in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's killing was what I was conditioned to do. I did. I'm an African-American man. I was Black before I was elected. I'll be Black when I'm done being Attorney General. And I have seen this too many times before. And I was conditioned to immediately believe that here we go again, another Black man being killed at the hands of law enforcement, and nothing's going to happen. That is not the type of conditioning that we should aspire to, or that we should feel suffices for our current level of existence. And that's the reason why I'm happy to see that this time it was a little different. We saw people coming together, immediately condemning what we saw happening in Minneapolis, and trying to figure out ways in which to move beyond conversation into the actual development and implementation of policy, but beyond that also the actual enforcement of that policy and discipline that's associated with violating those policies. And so these protests, I believe, have done a good job for us to be able to move the conversation forward. And I'm looking forward to having this conversation with my colleagues as well. So thanks again for joining us. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
And AG Ellison.
Hey, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be with my colleagues. Let me just say, as a preliminary matter, Democratic attorney generals are fighting for Americans' right to have access to the Affordable Care Act, fighting for Americans' right to have clean air, fighting for Americans to have immigration justice, fighting for housing and fair housing, taking on the issue of voting and democracy, and the issue of criminal justice reform and fair, humane policing. I just think that Democratic attorney generals, within the context of the Democratic family, are actually an underappreciated group, given the frontline work that we do every single day to advance democratic values. And those democratic values, I use a small d, not a big one. The small d democratic values of fairness, justice, liberty, and justice for all. And all of my colleagues on this panel are fighting for those things every single day in their own states, and we're fighting for those things together. And I just want everybody who's at this Democratic National Convention to know that Democratic AGs are fighting on the front line to advance the values of our country and our party, which are aligned in the same. And so I just want folks to be aware of that and to reach out to your Democratic AG, talk about your priorities, what you believe is critical, important, and to be in that conversation with them, because you will know about a consumer scam before we will, an injustice in voting before we will, an environmental abuse before we will, and we want to be in partnership with you. So thank you for having me, and glad to be here.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm Kwame Raoul. I'm an Attorney General in Illinois, speaking to you from my living room in Chicago. I mentioned Chicago because Chicago's been the center of a lot of attention, whether it's about constitutional policing, protests, community violence. Unfortunately, we've had a lot of light shone on us, and not always for great reasons. However, ever since I took my oath in January of last year, I, working along with my colleagues, the Democratic attorneys general from throughout the country, have been able to step forth in all of the ways that the previous speakers have indicated, whether it's workers' protection,
I think we may have lost AG Raul, so thank you. AG Jennings, if you could jump in, we'll try to get him back on the line.
Sure. Thank you, Karen. And it's a real honor to be with all of you today. Attorney General Ellen Rosenblum, you are a rock star, always have been, and you are our leader in the Democratic Attorney General world. I came into office at about the same time as my friends, AG Aaron Ford, Kwame Raoul, and Keith Ellison. And I could not be more proud of the work that they have done and how we lift each other up all the time to do the important work, because we are the people's lawyer and we protect the rights of all of the people we represent. I spent most of my career in the criminal justice system and ran for office for one simple reason. I wanted to make the criminal justice system fair and equal for everyone, regardless of the color of our skin, regardless of the size of our wallet, and regardless of the zip code where we live. It is a calling for me. It is a passion for me, because I have seen far too often and far too severely how the criminal justice system can treat people of color, people with no money to make bail, who have to sit in jail awaiting trial, and people who happen to live in an environment that frankly is over-policed at times. And so when I took office, I decided that I was going to roll my sleeves up and get started right away. And we're going to talk about a lot of those reforms today. But I could not have done the work that I am doing in the state of Delaware, the small but mighty state of Delaware, which tends to be in the limelight these days. I could not have done any of this without the help and support of my Democratic colleagues. These are times where real, meaningful change can happen. And the change is not going to be easy. The change is not going to be without significant opposition. But I'm convinced that if we are strong and we persevere, that we can do what people are telling us with loud voices in my state, across this nation, and indeed across the world in the wake of the horrible murder of George Floyd. We want our system to be fair, and we want everybody to be treated with respect and dignity. And if that doesn't happen, it's incumbent upon us to do the hard work that will make our system fair and equal for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. And AG Raul, I want to give you a chance to finish your remarks.
Well, let me just be brief, because I'm always the one with the technology snafus. I think COVID-19 and the pandemic has allowed us to really focus on some of the issues that we as Democratic AGs had already been focusing on. I mentioned earlier worker protection, access to healthcare, and of course, on the heels of the George Floyd murder, working on bringing about constitutional policing. We've done it. We've worked together. We've worked within our states, and we've worked with Congress to have language added on to the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act to allow state AGs to initiate patterns and practices investigations. So I want to thank the members of Congress for bringing us to the table, and thank my colleagues for working collectively on important policy.
Great. Thank you all so much for all of the work that you do. I want to kind of kick it off with a general question to set the stage here. So in most states, AGs are the top cops in their states. And that can create some hesitancy, especially for community activists when it comes to engaging with AGs on an issue like policing reform. I think it would be helpful and very informative for each of you to kind of speak to the important role that you play in policing reform in your collective posts. So AG Ford, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, you know, it's a very important point, and One of the things that I've already noted is something that I immediately noted in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing. Before I was elected Attorney General, I was a Black man living in this country. And I'm a Black man married to a Black woman, raising 3 Black sons and a Black nephew. And these are issues that are ever present in our existence. And I obviously do not believe as though it's a fair burden that African Americans have to carry in the context of these types of conversations. And so I view my opportunity now as a top law enforcement officer in the state as a unique intersection, as someone who endeavors to improve relationships between law enforcement and the communities that they serve, recognizing that I believe that there are at least 3 types of communities, the type of which some of us are familiar with. You see on, for example, Law and Order, where Olivia Benson is testifying on the witness stand and all of the jurors are agreeing with what she says. And if anyone says something different than what Olivia Benson has said, they're lying. The police speak the Bible. That's one type of community that exists. There's another type of community, however, where that high level of trust has been diminished for some reason. And so maybe it's because of vicarious experiences that they've seen happen to other folks, and maybe it's something personal that they've had as an interaction with law enforcement. But that high level of trust, they still have some level of trust. But then you have the types of communities that have no trust. Little to no trust at all. And that's the type of community from which I came, frankly, where we were happy to see them when bad things were happening in our community, but sometimes bad things happened when law enforcement came into our communities. And so what I've endeavored to do in my position as top law enforcement officer in the state is to augment trust where it already exists, to restore it where it's been diminished, and then to create it where it's never existed in the first place. And so using this opportunity to talk about constitutional policing and to talk about racial equity and to share the experience that I have had and that my sons have to experience, whether it's the ever evolving talk we have to have about not being able to wear a hoodie without a vigilante killing you, or not being able to jog without a former law enforcement officer killing you, or not being able to bird watch without someone calling the cops on you, or not being able to breathe because someone's neck is on your someone's knees on your neck for 8 minutes and 43 seconds. These are conversations that are very important, and the community members who come to talk to us have to feel as though they can actually reach out and have these conversations. There has been an instance in our state here where a local law enforcement officer threatened to, at least is perceived to have threatened, to withhold 911 services to a local library district because that library district dared to say that they ascribed to the notion that Black lives mattered. And I had to have a conversation with that sheriff, as well as the library board and others, to explain my position and how I disagreed with that, and to let them know that the top law enforcement officer in the state who represents the entire state is looking out for opportunities to improve our criminal justice system. And I think that type of reach out and that type of candor, I believe, is helpful in this conversation.
That's great perspective. Thank you. Do any of our other AGs want to chime in on their role in police reform?
Sure. So in Delaware, the Attorney General has full criminal jurisdiction, and that means we prosecute cases from misdemeanors on up to murders. And it's a somewhat unique jurisdiction that Delaware has, which means that we've worked pretty closely with law enforcement agencies all over the state. In our small state, there are 48 police departments, believe it or not. And, so we have a working relationship. And I truly believe that there are so many police officers who sign up to be police because they want to serve others. People who have community policing in their blood, who get out there, who really know their communities, who have relationships with people in the communities, and they're not strangers to each other. And that really brings me to the major point about reform in policing, as is reform throughout our criminal justice system. What's broken? And what's broken is the trust between the communities we serve and police, the trust between the communities we serve and our justice system. And it's incumbent upon us to understand that at a really deep and personal level. We can read books. We're all lawyers. We're used to reading books and history books, and we should do that. And all the articles that have been written over the years about policing. But I think until you get out in communities and you spend time and you really understand the fear they have, and in times the sense of abandonment, that no one cares about the way that they're being treated, and the disadvantages that they have when they go into the justice system. They're not going to be able to post $1,000 secure bail. And that means that that person is going to sit in jail until the trial occurs. You can't understand it unless you're there and you're talking to people and you really start to feel it on a very personal and deep level, and open your mind and your hearts to what's going on. And so you can't do it from behind a desk. I tell people in our office all the time, we need to get out and we need to get close. And then we can start to solve these real problems of trust. That doesn't mean that I'm going to walk into a town hall or a meeting and everybody's going to clap for Kathy Jennings. Quite the opposite. That means that we're going to have really difficult conversations and we're going to confront really difficult issues. But that's the only way we're going to start to solve these, by listening to each other.
Yeah, in Minnesota, I'm the chief legal officer, but I'm not necessarily the chief criminal enforcement officer. We do criminal prosecution. We do quite a lot of it. All of us do it in terms of Medicaid fraud. But in Minnesota, our system is essentially, it starts with the local county attorney having criminal jurisdiction in those counties in which the crime occurred. Now, there's 87 counties, and for about 80 of them, they need us to come in and try a lot of their serious cases. So we have an active criminal practice, but we are asked in and invited in. And it's a frequent, common thing. We prosecute a lot of cases every year across Minnesota, and we do a lot of criminal appeals for all but about 4 of the counties. So we do a lot of criminal stuff, but it is by invitation. So we are not in cases generally unless the county calls us in. Now, the governor can appoint me to represent the state. That's what happened in the George Floyd case. The governor said, I want you to prosecute this case. But the fact is that we find ourselves in the role of doing hands-on stuff, but also playing an important role in terms of being a convener of criminal justice conversations, important role in terms of informing the legislature as to the effect of a criminal justice policy. And so we take that seriously. One of the things we did recently is in 2019, me and the Commissioner of Public Safety did this report, working group on police-involved deadly force encounters. We had law enforcement, we had citizens, we had Republicans, we had Democrats, and we came up with a bunch of recommendations as to how we might change the criminal justice system and policing. One of the things we said is that the arbitration system is not working for chiefs or for citizens. A nameless, faceless arbitrator who simply defies the chief's recommendations to discharge and puts that officer back on the force is a real problem. We talked about officer wellness and the fact that you can't go from a horror or a horrific case to a horrific case to a horrific case to a horrific case and not have it have an impact on you. Officer wellness is something we put a lot of time and energy into discussing. We also talked about training, de-escalation, and implicit bias. And we talked about the fact that officers we do need a new and a more effective standard for use of force, and including deadly force. And we really do want to have it be last resort. We want it to be proportionate. We want officers to use space and time to preserve life and to not just use force when it's legally authorized, but when it's necessary to preserve their own life or someone else's. We had those kind of conversations. So we have a role to play on the ground, and we have a policy role to play. And so that's kind of what we do. And the Minnesota County Attorneys Association recommended that all deadly force encounters with police should be in the Attorney General's office. Our Senate Republicans didn't think that was the right policy, but the House did. But that's on the table now. My personal position is that that's not doing me any favors. If there's a deadly force encounter with the police, some citizens will say, we absolutely will be angry if you don't charge it. Others will say we're angry if you do charge it. So it's politically a difficult thing, but I still support it because I think that everybody in the state should know that when there's a state-sponsored actor takes the life of a citizen, that case is going to be dealt with fairly, expeditiously, and with fairness and justice by an independent party in terms of the investigation and the prosecution. So I do support the policy, though I'm kind of a little nervous if we ever get it. We'll be in for some interesting days, but I've been full-throated in support of it because I think it's the right way to go.
The same system that Attorney General Ellison has in Minnesota. So we're kind of, you're sure we're not your twin instead of whatever, the other city next door. But, you know, I agree that it's about trust. It really is about trust. And how do you get that trust? I mean, in my case, I am a privileged white attorney general in the state of Oregon. So what I do a lot of, and what I tell people I'm going to do a lot of, and I think I put my money where my mouth is I listen. And we do a lot of listening, and we have listening tours. We just finished up a whole series of community conversations. I lead task forces. I do have that authority. And then I can go to the legislature and say, our task force unanimously agreed. And the first case, my first task force that had a great result was the anti-police profiling task force. This was about now almost 5 years ago. And then my next one that I led was hate crimes task force and a transparency in public records task force. So when it came to today, and we have the protests and we had the situation with the federal agents on the ground here who wouldn't go home, they were uninvited, we wanted them out. People did turn to me, and I did take it up and bring the lawsuit, and you know, they're gone. They're gone. Now, I'm not saying it's because of me. I mean, our governor cut a deal, and thank you to Kate Brown. But if you don't have an attorney general who's a good listener and who knows how to convene, as we've been talking about, and who brings people together, diverse viewpoints, if you just bring the same old people to the table, you're not going to get the outcomes that you need. And thankfully, this time around at our legislature, we've already had 2 special sessions since the protests, and we have accomplished an amazing thing. We already have changed our law with House Bill 4301, which aligns our deadly force statutes with modern standards of policing. That would never have happened. It wouldn't have happened this year. It wouldn't have happened before our next legislative session, that's for sure. But it happened because of the protesters. It happened because of our People of Color caucus. And it happened because of the sense of urgency that we can't waste time. We have to get this done now, because it's about saving lives and it's about fairness and equality.
Exactly. AG Raul, I wanted to make sure we got you in. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. I kept forgetting to hit my mute button, unmute button. But listen, all of us as AGs, we've got to learn to walk and chew gum. We're so multifaceted in our office, in our respective offices, that we often juggle 2 things that may be inconsistent with one another. And sometimes, I know in my case, I've got to build walls in my office. You gain credibility with the community when you work on things when they're not on the heels of protests, when you talk about issues when they're not as popular to talk about. I know in my case, I worked as a legislator on police reform legislation 5 years ago, and then I inherited an AG's office that had filed suit when the Justice Department stepped back with regards to unconstitutional policing within the Chicago Police Department. But one of the things that your question raises is this, what has happened on the heels of George Floyd's murder and subsequent demonstrations and a period in which we've seen a lot of community violence on the rise as well, there's a false dichotomy that many of us espouse, where when you mention racial bias in policing or the need for police reform, people respond with talking about black on black crime. Or alternatively, when you're denouncing violence towards police officers or destruction towards businesses during protests, people say, well, what about police abuse? We can and we must, not only as AGs, but as communities at large, be opposed to both unconstitutional policing and community violence, including that directed towards police officers and business owners during protests. I'm all for lifting up protests that force us as policymakers, force legislators as policymakers to act, but I don't embrace violence, whether it's coming from a police officer or whether it's towards a police officer.
Those are great points. AG Raul, I actually want to stay with you. So you raised the point of this kind of false dichotomy. I want to actually ask this question first. The president has often attacked Chicago by pushing this false narrative about violence and protests in the city, and then blaming city leaders that are in charge for that violence. And so can you talk about how you confront that attention and that pressure that's created by that false dichotomy that's put forward by folks like the president?
Well, first thing that I say that came out of President Trump's mouth, and as we've learned over the last 3.5 years, anything that comes out of his mouth lacks credibility. Mm-hmm. But secondly, we here, one of the things that I've been working on along with law enforcement officers, working with law enforcement officers to advance police reform. That doesn't mean that we had, unfortunately, community violence that pre-existed this era, this pandemic era. It's been existing. Actually, our community violence numbers, if you trace them back to the 90s, our violence numbers are down as compared. That's not to say it's at all at an acceptable level, but the false narrative that President Trump has put on things as a distraction to his inability to lead us during a pandemic, it needs to be ignored. Do we have problems in Chicago? Absolutely. Do we have community violence problems in Chicago? Absolutely. But we have to look at all of the origins of why that violence occurs. I don't know of anybody who came out of the womb with a gun in their hand and an attitude to do violence towards their neighbors. Something has happened during the course of their life. Disinvestment in their neighborhoods, lack of mental health, investment into mental health care, lack of investment into education. If you look at the communities where we have high levels of violence, we have that high level of disinvestment, and we can't ignore that clear evidence. And so when we talk about dealing with the violence problem in Chicago or any other major municipality throughout the country, we have to look at it comprehensively.
That's a great point and a great segue to AG Jennings, because you're talking about these issues of systemic racism, issues that are just systemic all throughout the criminal justice system, as well as for our protesters. So AG Jennings, can you kind of speak to how important it is for AGs to make sure that they're addressing these systemic issues from beginning to end as we try to reduce these initial interactions with police in the first place?
Sure. I say we all need to hit the ground running. I mean, I've been Attorney General for 1 year and 8 months. And when I started on day one, as I said, my passion was criminal justice reform. And the hardest thing for human beings to do, I think, is to look inside yourself. It's really easy to tell other people what to do, but it's really hard to look inside and say, okay, we have to look at our own shop. And how can we change the things that are unfair, unequal, directed at one race above another, and having these really negative impacts that has caused distrust, and rightfully has caused distrust in the system. And so we enacted a number of internal reforms before we ever went to the legislature to do a thing. The overarching principle was that we don't have to choose between safety and justice. And if we choose justice, safety will follow. So inside the office, our prosecutors agreed. Actually, they came up with a number of these reforms to rely more on diversion away from the system altogether and less on prison sentences. To de-emphasize low-level drug crimes that have long been an entry point into the system for non-violent offenders and have disproportionately impacted Black people. No longer seeking warrants ever for failure to pay a fine or fee, because you're imprisoning people for poverty at that point, and it is counterproductive. We worked with our legislature to highlight drug code reform, because what we saw was that the way our laws were written, they disproportionately impacted Black people in our state. Because the mere possession of drugs, if you live within a certain amount of space, like 1,000 feet of a school, a park, a playground, a church, then you're automatically charged with a felony. That wasn't right. And we dramatically overhauled the drug laws. Once we showed the legislature the racial disparities at play, who was getting arrested for a felony versus a misdemeanor, and it was white misdemeanor, Black felony. And they saw the light and they said, yeah, this is just flat out isn't right. And they saw it on a bipartisan basis. We worked to have arrests, convictions capable of being expunged for the first time in Delaware. That means that even people with low-level convictions could get their convictions expunged so they could get a job. It was a jobs bill. It was marketed as a jobs bill, and it received unanimous support in our Delaware Senate and almost unanimous in the House. People understand the need to help pull us out of this rut we're in, out of this over-reliance on incarceration and cookie-cutter justice system. And that was a really good beginning. But we have so much more work to do, because one part of the system can't work at cross purposes with another. And I believe that there are so many good police officers in our state who want change, who are welcoming change. But there are factions at play who say, no, not our problem. We don't want any kind of change. I believe in the changes in our system and policing that are actually going to matter. Like having body-worn cameras on every police officer in those 48 police departments, like real civilian oversight of investigations involving unlawful force, like having real community policing, where police officers know they're out of their cars and they know other members of the community, and they are one of them. Having a much richer, more diverse police department, and giving the AG's office the ability to do pattern and practice criminal investigations and prosecutions of violence against human beings under color of law. We now have the power to do investigations into shootings that are fatal or non-fatal. We have decided to expand that power into all uses of unlawful force. And so these are all just, one change at a time, but they're very important. Perhaps among them, what will be the most difficult, but the most important, is increasing transparency in the process itself of disciplining police. And that's going to involve a change in our state law, because we have one of the most secretive processes in the country. But these are the things I'm going to fight for, along with a lot of great people. The young activists in our state, not all young, but mostly young, they just have awakened the majority of people to join them and say, we need change. This is a moment in time that we all need to capture. And I know every AG here tonight is doing that, is capturing that moment. We can't let it die. We can't let time be our enemy. We just have to keep at it until we make the changes that are meaningful.
Thank you. And AG Ford, I want to turn to you. You mentioned this earlier, the incident of the sheriff basically saying that they're not going to respond to public safety issues because the local library has spoken out in support of Black Lives Matter. Can you talk about the issue of protecting and preserving the right of these protesters in this moment and sustaining this movement and balancing their constitutional right to push from the outside to help support these meaningful reforms at the state, local, and federal level, and balancing that with the actions of law enforcement trying to challenge that effort?
Yeah, listen, I think AG Raul hit the nail on the head when he talked about attorneys general having to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. He, as was I, was a former legislator. And I recall in the legislature also pursuing some criminal justice reform matters, but at the same time pursuing some matters that would support our law enforcement. It's interesting because I would always recognize some who would say they would support law enforcement, but when it came to, for example, supporting their pension, they'd vote no. I'd hit the green button to support them taking care of their families. Others would hit the red button, but they would be the ones who would be perceived as pro-police. I passed a bill, for example, that said that when law enforcement officers are targeted, I'm originally from Dallas, Texas, and as you may recall, there was a vigilante who targeted a lot of law enforcement and killed some in Dallas. And I passed a bill here in Nevada that says when you target a law enforcement officer, because that person is a law enforcement officer, that's tantamount to a hate crime, and you get enhanced penalties because of it. So, I've demonstrated on the one hand that I have a great admiration and support for law enforcement, while at the same time letting law enforcement know that I will hold you accountable. And not only will I hold you accountable, but these protesters have the right to hold people accountable when they are violating constitutional rights. And so this discussion that ensued in one of our rural counties here was an important one because it was a false dichotomy. To say that you believe that Black Lives Matter does not mean that you don't believe that you believe that all law enforcement are bad. That is simply untrue. It is not true. And it is not true to say that because you agree that Black Lives Matter, that you must also agree that violence is the key and you want to bring violence to neighborhoods. In fact, it's just the opposite. Black Lives Matter, and from my perspective, attempts to alleviate and to eradicate violence, but predominantly of law enforcement. So speaking boldly about these issues and not shying away from it just because you're going to have some butting of heads, if you will, I think is key. One of the things I live by is always speak truth to power, especially if you're in a position of power. Because if you don't, it's a wasted opportunity. So as the top law enforcement officer in the state, who's also a Black man, the intersection that I have here and the ability to be able to talk about this issue, I think would be wasted if I did not specifically reach out to the sheriff and voice my displeasure in his comments and also speak out in favor of those who are peacefully protesting. And I want to finish my comment by acknowledging something else. One of the things that I've noticed is that most people are able to distinguish between protesters and rioters, recognizing that they are not the same, and recognizing that while some want to co-opt a protest, and by co-opt, I mean we had Boogaloo Boys, a white supremacist organization, trying to co-opt a BLM march in Vegas, and they came with Molotov cocktails trying to blow up federal entities. So recognizing that protesters are not the same as rioters, and and that the protesters who are out there legitimately speaking on issues of import to them should be protected, and their rights should be protected, irrespective of their position of what they're talking about. And one more thing I'll say. I'm sorry. One more thing.
Go ahead.
Let's not forget that these protests were not the first protests we've seen since COVID hit. In fact, I recall seeing protests with Caucasian individuals, predominantly in military attire and guns, storming, if you will, capitals. And this issue of the right to protest took on a different type of tone of conversation, if you will. So, I mean, I think it's important to note that we as law enforcement officers, we as the top law enforcement officers in the state protected their right to protest when they were in fatigues and guns, just like we protect the right to protest of Black Lives Matters individuals who are pushing for racial justice. And so I think that's an interesting dichotomy to talk about as well.
No, it's a very important point, especially when you consider the fact that a lot of the protests that we've seen, you know, you have to look for a Black person in some of these cities. A lot of these racial justice protests that are, you know, folks that are speaking out about police brutality and calling for police reform, it's a rainbow coalition of people across the community calling for it. So it's very interesting that when we're calling for police reform, it's one thing, but when it's, you know, I need to reopen and yeah, then it's another thing. But AG Rosenblum, we have to bring you into this piece because, you know, we have seen the president basically throw out this dog whistle, which feels more like a bullhorn at this point, of law and order in justifying deploying federal agents into your state to try to control these protesters. I really want you to speak to the importance of balancing the rights as an AG of your citizens at the state level to have this ability to protest and exercise their First Amendment rights, when at the federal level you have the President of the United States trying to deploy troops essentially in unmarked vans with no labels or nameplates. I really just, you know, we all saw the videos and it's been national news, and really want to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure, thank you. Well, we're very glad, first of all, that the federal agents that were sent here for this totally improper purpose, they weren't sent to protect the federal building. There already were plenty of federal agents here in Oregon who do a very good job of protecting federal buildings. They were sent here, unfortunately for political reasons, to create some nice ad copy for the president to demonstrate that only he could protect our cities, which is absolutely false. And how odd that he would pick Portland, Oregon. I mean, we certainly have our share of problems, but we did not need the feds to be here. What we became concerned about was that, you know, whatever the reason, whatever the motivation, our protesters were no longer, were not being kept safe, and their First Amendment rights to protest and to get to the point where we are now, where we actually have something to show for it, some really excellent reforms already accomplished and more in the making. We had to do something about that. So as you're aware, my office brought a lawsuit to try to not so much get rid of them. It never asked for that, but it did ask that they identify themselves and that they provide the rights that a person on the street who's not committing a crime. These were not people engaged in crime. They were simply people who were protesters, peacefully protesting for the most part, on their way home from a protest, being grabbed and thrown into these unmarked vans. So we brought this lawsuit in order to protect our people's rights, First Amendment rights. So what I want to just suggest is a couple of things that are important, and that I think we've done a pretty good job, and we have to do more to get there. But the first and foremost is equipping and mandating police, whatever level, whether they're local, state, or federal, to de-escalate rather than escalate protests. These agents that came in we were specifically told had not been trained in de-escalation tactics. Quite the opposite. They were actually accustomed to some pretty rough activity down at the border, which is improper as well. But nevertheless, we're not a border state except for the ocean. So it was a very odd thing to have sent these border, I think they have a special sort of tactical team that they sent here that typically is used for those purposes. Another thing that's really important is to better regulate the tools and tactics that police use to respond to crowds. And that's what many of us are doing in conjunction with our proposed reforms, tear gas reforms, the less lethal munitions, which are actually quite lethal or can be. In fact, we have a criminal investigation ongoing against the federal agents that aimed these so-called less lethal munitions at some peacefully protesting individuals, pepper spray and such. And then finally, of course, holding agencies and individual officers accountable for civil rights violations, for their criminal behavior or their excessive force. So those are all ways in which we are taking steps, the state, the city governments, to keep protesters safe and to ensure their right to protest so that we can get these reforms that are so critical. But stay tuned, our lawsuit's still pending.
Well, we thank you for that.
Our lawsuit's still pending.
Fingers crossed. I want to stay on this kind of this political rhetoric that's out there before we move to the next topic, and that's on the defund the police movement. You know, the GOP is really launching a lot of baseless attacks against Democratic AGs in claiming that they're soft on crime and you know, somehow more concerned with getting rid of police than public safety. How do you all respond to that? Any of our communications focused AGs?
Well, I would just say that's a false narrative. And I think what Donald Trump has been trying to do from the beginning is use the protests to scare people. And he is trying to tell Americans that the people saying stop killing us are violent. And we know that the people saying stop killing us are not violent. They're exercising their First Amendment rights. And so, you know, defund the police has become a mantra as opposed to a message that has some substance to it. There's a legitimate question, I think, that people are asking about, should we put more money into social work, mental health services, addiction treatment, so many of the root causes of crime, and less into the criminal justice system and less into policing. And I think that's a legitimate and quite interesting conversation to have. And should we, as AG Rosenblum said, stop militarizing the police to the extent we have? Those are real things. But instead, I think defund the police is being used as a scare tactic, and it's being used to sort of say us against them, right? It's these protesters who, as we all know, overwhelmingly have been nonviolent. And they've been making change happen because of their protests. You know, I joined the largest protest in Wilmington. It was large by our measure, and it was really well run. People were peaceful, but they had their say, and they had it forcefully, and that resonated throughout our state. In one Delaware protest, 22 protesters were arrested, including a photojournalist, for nonviolent offenses in connection with a demonstration for racial justice. After reviewing what happened in this protest, we declined to charge any of them. I got attacked really hard by the Fraternal Order of Police, and they said we were attacking the police and taking the side of, quote, violent criminals. But those protesters were never charged with a violent offense, not one of them. They were charged with the unclassified misdemeanor of disorderly conduct. They had a right to be where they were, and they had a right to protest in the manner they did. We have to stand up for that as attorneys general across this country. Civil disobedience is one of the hammers that built this nation, and it's in our DNA from the very beginning, and it has caused change to be made. I am not anti-police, but I am pro-protesters exercising their rights. And I think it's really important for anyone to twist the narrative that, oh, we want all police departments to go away. We want to defund the police. These are violent people. Look what they're doing in our cities. Is just stoking fear. And I don't think people are buying it. I don't think the majority of Americans are buying it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. My boss, Rep. Karen Bass, chair of the CBC, always says that defund the police is also about refunding the community. And AG Ellison, I think that speaks to what you were talking about earlier in terms of kind of systemic racism across the board in terms of housing and education and healthcare, all of these issues. But to keep us on track with time, I want to ask one last question, and each of you will have 1 minute to answer. And that's just something that's forward-looking and hopefully inspirational. There are a lot of folks that are out in the community. They may have been protesting. They may want to go protest. But they kind of seeing the news and all that we've discussed might have some fear about how to make sure that they can protest and exercise their First Amendment rights, but do it safely. So can each of you, in 1 minute or less, just give some practical advice on how folks can stay involved in the movement, exercise their rights, and make sure that they do so safely?
Sure, you could start out by creating the wall of moms like we did in Portland, because there's nothing like a bunch of moms to protect the protesters. So that's number one. Make sure that when you do go out, you protect yourself and others against COVID. So always wear a mask. Bring protective gear, just in case. In Portland, there were some very creative ways of protecting our protesters. They'd bring a helmet to protect their heads. They'd bring protective eyewear. There was some more controversial equipment they would bring, like leaf blowers. So I'm not necessarily recommending that, but it did work well to get the tear gas blown in the other direction. And of course, travel in groups during, before, and of course after the protest. And because that's what happened here in Portland. The people that were getting picked up were just on their way home by these unmarked, unnamed, unidentified officers. So be very careful. Offer people a ride if it's safe to do so. If you see someone walking by themselves, of course, you always want to make sure that you tell your emergency contacts where you're going, both beforehand and afterwards. So those are just some of my thoughts for protesters. We have a lot of young, wonderful people here in Portland out every night. They're still out. They've just kind of moved outside the downtown area. So we're very concerned about keeping them safe.
What I would say, Karen, is that is the advice I've given. I've got young adult children, not children, children of mine, but young
They're
adults.
always your children.
And I've engaged in a debate with them, and what I've said is go beyond the taglines, right? Don't allow yourself to be attached to just a tagline. Dig a little bit deeper into the needed policy changes. Don't just rest at defund the police or abolish the police. Go deeply into the policies behind those taglines, and just don't allow a movement to be hijacked. And so how you do so is go to your state house, go to your AD's office, go to Congress, and let this not just be something that, unfortunately, we have these discussions on the heels of somebody dying at the hands of police. And these are discussions that we should have continuously.
Great advice. Any of our other AGs have some advice before we run out of time?
Go ahead, Keith. I'm not sure that, honestly, to be honest, I'm not sure what you tell people to be safe, because, I got journalists in Minneapolis who were arrested not doing a single thing to anyone other than aiming a camera. I got other journalists shot in the eye with a rubber bullet who weren't doing a single thing to anyone. I got people who were standing there and the officer just drove down the street and sprayed pepper spray out of the window of the squad. Now, you ask me, how do people stay safe? I don't know what to tell people to do when they're doing stuff like that. But what I will say is that hold yourself with dignity, raise your voice, speak your truth. Don't hurt or destroy anything, but lift your voice up to build a better, more constructive society. Understand that if you want to improve policing and criminal justice, some people who want it like it is are not going to like that. and nobody on this panel can guarantee your safety. But if you're willing to get out there and lift your voice the way John Lewis did, you might just change this whole country. And so I ask people to get out there, to be strong, to don't back down, and to remember that even if we change policing, we still need to change inequitable housing, voting, and a whole range of other things that are in trouble in this society. And the Democratic AGs are fighting on all those fronts, and we're here to fight with you. So thank you.
Amen. AG Jennings, you were going to say something?
Sure. Thank you. The activists in Delaware, I've had the pleasure of meeting and getting to know, and they've said, well, we're not going to stop. And I say, don't stop. You can't stop, because as soon as people think that there's a chance to leave things the same, who don't want change, then they're going to do that, and we won't get the change done. But turn your energy into action. Coalesce around laws you want changed and lobby the legislature. I mean, a lot of our laws have to be changed, and they're not going to be changed unless the legislature hears their voices. The activists in our state have really done an amazing job protesting, and they are now asking to be on legislative task forces to make these changes. They want to be at the table. They don't want to be left behind. They want to be at the table, and that's what's going to work. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. And AG Ford, last but not least. Yes.
Absolutely. And I won't offer any additional advice. I think you got some great advice beginning with AG Rosenblum, giving you a litany of things you can do to stay safe. And I agree with what Keith has said. It's difficult when everybody's not playing fairly, right? You could be doing nothing and something bad could still happen. But it's like Kathy said as well. And I say this, I'll never forget my then 78, 80-year-old father-in-law reminded me one time that people called him boy till he was 40 years old. And that, to me, it makes me say, if the worst I got to do is do a little bit of name calling, then I'm standing in tall cotton. His generation had water hoses turned on him and dogs sicked on him. And if the worst I got to do is have someone call me out my name, then I'm doing just fine. Recognize that protest is part of the process, and this process leads to progress. Because they don't call me boy, they call me Dr. Ford, they call me senator, they called me senator, they called me attorney general, they will call me by my name. And I think that's part of what we have to recognize these protests are intended to do, and that's to move the ball forward. So keep doing it, even if it's seeming difficult. So I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this conversation.
No, thank you all. I really hope it's been helpful and instructful to our listeners, not only to hear all of the work that you all are doing, but how important it is to keep you in office and to make sure that we are electing Democratic AGs across the country to continue to do this work in partnership with the state, local, and federal government, as we make sure that this moment is also a movement and we are going to win the progress of police reform and more. Thank you all for joining.